And one of the things that I've also seen is this fear that we'll discover that when it comes to trading partners like the Chinese, they have no clothes. And that all of a sudden they do rig their system, and the 25% tariff on American cars versus our 2.5% on theirs.
Absolutely.
That, you know, people always say the president's igniting a trade war. A lot of people looking at this are saying, well, wait a minute.
We're already in a trade war.
Right. So how do you think this plays out? What do you think the Chinese do?
We all know their mercantilism has bordered on the grotesque in a lot of ways. I mean, any company that wants to do business with them, American or others, we know they steal intellectual property. We know they have punitive licensing terms. Everybody agrees something needs to be done. So to the president's credit, he promised he would do it. He is doing something. Tariffs are a very blunt instrument. They have to be highly targeted,
Chinese,
highly
right?
selective.
They work for the Chinese?
So long as we let them, Neil, and there is this dynamic tension.
Right.
You know, we are their biggest customer. You know, they are also our biggest creditor. So, you know, we all have to come to an agreement here. And I think, USA Today, among many others, has said, look, smart way to do it, let's make sure we're partnering with friendly nations. You know, let's revisit a Trans-Pacific partnership. You know, just don't rule it out completely. Work through the WTO. Get partner
we bowed out of
nations
that,
so that we
thinking that it wasn't worth it.
But I think, the president's showing that he is firm when he introduces these tariffs. We know that he's serious about Chinese trade. I think if he decided to reintroduce the idea of joining a Trans-Pacific partnership and the concept of a tough approach to China, I think he'd have more leverage there.
His view has been, Dan, I think, and you can correct me on this, is that, Republican Democratic presidents in the past have all tried the nice approach. Let's talk about this and see what we could change. And nothing's changed. So he thinks this more blunt instrument is the way to change it. Do you think it is?
I'm not so sure. I think one of the reasons is not only the fact that it interrupts a lot of international supply chains, but to Christine's point, when you do this sort of thing, what you discover is there are political implications and consequences inside the United States. The Wall Street Journal has a fascinating story today about how agriculture interests across the Midwest are terrified at the idea of putting tariffs on China because they export so much into China.
And they believe they're a target, right?
They believe they're a target. I would assume that a lot of them and the people working for them, and Nan mentioned steel fabricators and Christine was saying, those are also Trump voters. And if they're going to be damaged by this, the president runs the risk of driving a wedge into the Republican voters out there in the midterms. They have to be nervous about what's going on. I think that's why presidents have always been a little bit careful about these trade negotiations.
Well, that's what the Chinese count on, too, though, that will blink.
Yeah. I mean, in 2002, we have the Bush steel tariffs as historical precedent. And, those were more costly than they were worth.
They were
we had
midstream.
200,000 people out of work in 2002, and that continued for the next couple of years. And so if you look back at that, it wasn't really worth, what we gained.
And
but
President Obama.
The argument, I just want to follow up on that. What wasn't the argument that was raised at the time? It wasn't worth it. This president now is changing it around. It's not worth it continuing to kowtow to them. That he has long argued the Chinese need us a heck of a lot more than we need them. Do you agree with that?
I mean, sure, and we'll find out when this happens.
Sounds like you have your doubts.
Well, I do have my doubts just based on 2002. I mean, the one thing that we had going for us was that, companies are very good at restructuring their supply chains to deal with and make sure that there's diminishing negative impact when we implement tariffs. And we're in a very strong corporate earnings environment right now. Tax reform is certainly going to help this year. So we have a strong underlying economy. I think more than any other time, companies are in a position where maybe they wouldn't have to reduce workforce as much. However, that doesn't mean that they won't. I mean, they'll cut costs. If there are rising costs, they'll either pass it on to consumers or they'll have to.
Well, I don't know how much they can pass along, right? I mean, one of the
easiest thing is to cut workforce.
You're right. But one of the things that we've counted on is that, in this case, the administration wants the Chinese to recognize that they're the ones up against the wall here. But the Chinese might figure, to your point, that well, wait a minute. We can punish you, we can punish your agricultural interests, or we could stop or slow down buying your debt. How likely are either of those in a realistic scenario right now? Because that wowould be a war. We've escalated it to the next level.
I think the Chinese are probably willing to take risks past some point, but I don't think any of us.
What makes you say that, though, when their initial salvo response was $3 billion worth of targeted goods, very carefully, if not tentatively?
Well, there's a point beyond which even the Chinese would have to react and start targeting specific industries in the United States that are tied to Trump and his base. But I don't think anyone disagrees that the administration is on the right track. The Chinese have to be taken on in areas like intellectual property theft and forcing American companies to have Chinese partners that then take their business away from them. There is no disagreement on that. But they're going to need allies to be able to pull that off, because a lot of other companies trade with China, depend on Chinese trade. So it's going to take
and a lot of other countries do too, right? So they must be salivating at the prospect of our alienating China. They'll swoop in, right?
And that's why trade policy requires a sophisticated and nuanced approach. And one
I don't think nuance has ever worked with the Chinese. It really hasn't.
Well, but President Trump he's not ideological, he's not dogmatic, he is pragmatic. And we know that merely in the past 3 weeks, he first announced a very blunt, as we know, across the board tariff on steel and aluminum. Very quickly, the market response and other outcry, potential threats that he clearly could perceive led him to moderate that. He's a negotiator.
But if things got worse for him, if he knew where this was heading, and to your point that it was heading for a trade war, governments, to your points, do not pay these tariffs. Individuals do.
Right.
He would have to tell individuals, right? You're going to pay a lot more for this. He'd have to rally a nation to support him on something that might be very unpopular. How's that going to go?
Especially if they're losing jobs and you're telling them that costs are going to increase. That could be a very dangerous situation, and that's something that when voters hit the polls in November, they would really take into consideration. I mean, you're reducing, that then would filter into so many other industries, both consumer-facing, automotives, airlines, and that would really feel everyone if you've got people losing their jobs and then therefore reducing their purchasing power.
Worst case, would it even get that bad?
I mean, if you look back to 2002, sure. I mean, we weren't in the worst economic situation, but it slowly deteriorated from there. And I think people still remember the financial crisis, and it's still very much in the front of their minds.
We did have a little bit of a recession that would come after, that was a slowdown after the internet boom. So it could happen again, right?
Yeah, you're playing with fire there. I mean, you don't want to go into a recession after doing all the positive things that came out of the tax cut and the deregulation, the economy's growing, the market's going up. But the market is obviously very nervous about what's going on in these trade negotiations.
Well, the market right now seems to think we won't have a problem with this.
That's in the last 48 hours. But if the president sort of starts talking again about imposing tariffs on China, the market could turn in the other direction.
And I think politically the president has to concern himself with the House because, as you said, Dan, the Chinese can definitely target certain areas and districts. They're keeping track of American politics. They know where they have pain points and manipulative opportunities. So, the president's going to be very sensitive to those districts that are at risk, particularly in agricultural communities and others, where jobs definitely could be very badly affected by retaliatory measures.
This is all about the North Koreans. This is all subterfuge. It's all about finding a way to deal with North Korea, to have China help us and to force this. Do you guys agree with that?
I kind of doubt it. I mean, I
should explain. He was also saying that the Chinese helping to find a neutral venue for the two leaders to meet. That was another thing. It did sound a little goofy to me, but,
Well, Kim Jong-un reportedly was just in Beijing. I mean, a very surprising, mysterious, something is going on out there, obviously, in the background.
And are these tariffs part of it?
I doubt that they're part of it,
Sounds
but
like
they obviously figure in. It's a lot.
They wouldn't exactly charm the Chinese.
Well, that's why the markets get nervous about this sort of thing. North Korea is the biggest problem out there immediately right now. It's bigger than the problem of trade with China. But the Chinese are clearly a solution to the North Korean problem. So, we've got a new Secretary of State. We got a new National Security Advisor. We got kind of a new ball game. It's
Write all those names in pencil, though.
And Larry Kudlow in the administration to help us strengthen the economy even more, because that is our number one.
And he's against this.
But that, well, and fair enough. Larry's got very well informed opinions, and the president, I'm sure, will listen to him closely, because our number one defense and offense, in a sense, is a strong economy. And the president's made great strides toward that.
Kudlow is